Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to another boss ranking video for Final Fantasy XIV. You know, I wasn't going to do this one because I talk about Criterion and the bosses quite a bit, but I realized I've ranked every other series boss. You know, I've done the Trials, and I've done the Raid, and I've done the Alliance Raid. Why not do the Criterion bosses as well, especially if it's going to become a regular thing in future expansions, as it seems like it will in Dawn Trail. So, with that, in this video, I am ranking the 9 Endwalker Criterion bosses from worst to best. And let's start off with number 9, which is actually going to be from the most recent Criterion, and that of Alo Alo, the Lala, which is the second boss. You know, this boss was one of those that's kind of like a brain teaser. If your brain's not wired to do it correctly, then it causes a lot of frustration. But the mechanic that does it is kind of out of the way so quick that most of the boss is kind of just a snoozeville. It's not as interesting of a puzzle to solve as the other bosses. It's a lot more traditional and not unique related stuff, getting hit to reduce stacks and also making sure to properly lay down puddles and then spread and then stack. It's the least kind of unique feeling boss other than the rotating mechanics that it comes with. That being said, players who struggle with that rotating mechanic are going to find this boss much more interesting, much harder, and much more frustrating than players who do not. It is such an individual test of this skill that at the very least I can say, if you have an issue with mechanics that start facing one direction and rotate to face another one, this is a boss that can test that skill and can improve that skill, and you should probably spend time on it to fix that individual skill of yours up. Moving on to number 8, this was a tough one. I feel like all the rest of them I didn't necessarily feel that negatively about, but with only 9 bosses, I have to have some stuff that's kind of lower on the scale. Number 8 is Shishio. This is the first boss from the Mount Rock-On Criterion dungeon, and on content, it's one of those that, like, progressing it, I was like back and forth. How much do I really like this fight? Is it unique? Is it interesting? And I think that visually it's a lot of fun. I think it's very fast-paced and frantic, and that definitely makes it a pretty interesting prog experience, dodging all of the laser beams coming out of the different clouds and making sure to remember certain little details. But that encompasses so much of the fight that once that comfort is obtained, there's really not a lot of substance to what Shishio is asking you to do until the second half of the encounter, where you have to do the ghosts in the towers and the ghosts raising their hands, as I like to say it, the high-fiving ghosts that you get. The 2 ghost mechanics are pretty well done, and the rest is just kind of almost YOLO in a sense. You know, there's like kind of a pattern you have to know, and then a couple of YOLO cloud patterns, and that just consumes so much of the fight's time that I had to knock him down lower in the scale, as much as I actually find this boss fun. I guarantee you, if you ask a melee or a tank about this boss, there's a good chance they would have put it at number 9 because of the shenanigans that go on with the lasers firing at a few of the points. But Shishio lands at number 8 for me, and honestly, I don't think that's that bad of a spot. It's still, I felt like a really fun boss to prog on and reclear. And number 7 gets even tougher because I don't really feel that poorly about this boss either, and that of the Gladiator of Sildy. This is the second boss for the first one, the Sildian Subterrane. And this boss I actually, again, really liked progging. It's a pretty fast-paced boss. The damage is really serious, and it requires a decent combination of teamwork, attention paid, and individual responsibility. It's very balanced in that regard. Certain markers and certain tells can make things a lot more, or I guess a lot less impactful as you learn them. So it does have that kind of, the more you do it, the less interesting it is fatigue, but not to the level that numbers 8 and 9 were on this list. Honestly, it's kind of unfortunate that I think all of the second bosses, which we'll talk about shortly, are kind of the weakest points of Criterion, but it's not because they're not great bosses, or not even that they're not good bosses. It's that they really struggle to distinguish themselves between a really strong first boss and a really strong third boss. You know how when I'm doing my raid rankings, I always talk about how the third fight in the tier is kind of the mystery one of whether or not it'll be good or bad? That kind of happens here too. The sandwiched boss ends up, in my opinion, being weaker than both of the other encounters that it's sandwiched between. That being said, the one example over this that won't be true will be number 6, as I'm sure you've already figured out. But Gladiator, still think it's a cool fight, but it had to go down here because the next 6, I think, are just way better designed. They test way more important skills and are just more interesting, even like aesthetically. Like, this boss is not that cool aesthetically either, which really doesn't help, but I'm not going to knock him too much for that. And like I said, as you probably guessed, number 6 is going to be Gorai. This is the second boss of Mount Rokon, and this is the toughest placement because the only reason he's ending as number 6 here, I just redid Mount Rokon the other day, and I went back and I was doing Gorai, and after doing the third Criterion, I felt less excited about Gorai as a fight than I did when I was doing it on content, when I cleared it a few times getting ready for Savage, which are really the two experiences. It's quite interesting going back when you haven't done these in a while and then just kind of remembering them and trying to, I guess, fill in the blanks, if that makes sense. And Gorai has a lot of kind of sleeper mechanics that don't really require a whole lot of knowing anything. There's maybe 1 or 2 patterns to the meteors at the start. You know, you really only need the tank and the healer for the shrinking the orb and the stack mechanic. The fact that DPS do nothing there is really strange. The tower and tether mechanics, in fact, both of the tower mechanics are actually really strong points, especially the final one, which if you're really, really well geared or you're doing a lot of damage and you haven't made too many mistakes, you'll very likely skip that on normal mode, but you really need to know it for Savage, and it can get really spicy in terms of mitigation, healing, and damage. Even on normal, it can get pretty rough. So he definitely gets a few points for creativity in those, and the tethers during the towers, I think, is a really good test. And nowadays, I look at it and I'm like, oh no, it's Omega. I don't want another Omega. I remember thinking that when I was doing it. It's like, oh no, it's Pantocrator. Oh no, it's not Pantocrator. It's a Looper. That's what I was like, oh no, it's a mini Looper. What do I do? But overall, way less frustrating, really easy to position around, to adjust for, and an okay boss. Again, just has to get stuck down here because the next 5 bosses, I think, are significantly better. Now, this number 5 is going to surprise some people because a lot of hype has been brought to this boss for its thematics, as well as the execution of the boss mechanics itself. And that is our final boss from Criterion 3, and that of Status, or Status. I don't know what the pronunciation is. I'm sure someone will tell me in the comment section. So Status is Fairy with a gun. And while it's a very creative encounter, especially the trick reload mechanic, where you have to watch which 2 chambers get loaded in, and that determines how certain AoEs and mechanics work throughout the rest of the other mechanics that are happening, as well as the individual mechanics. The dartboard, I think, is a really nice one. It's a really nice force positioning / adjustment test with just a couple of people. But I feel like it's kind of, I feel like the big problem with this fight is it's very oversolved by only having 4 people. I think this is one of those mechanics that is easier because there's 4 people and not harder. And generally with a lot of the other Criterion bosses, only having 4 people kind of there's a lot of pressure to get into solving everything correctly. And while I don't think that pressure is necessarily less here, when you see, oh, these 3 people have a debuff out of the 4 people and there's 3 colors on the ground, like things like that automatically solve themselves. And like things like the downtime mechanic with the missiles and the claws, that also kind of automatically solves itself because of what space is available on the arena. Even though our group did it in the most difficult way possible by not doing adjustments for what we call the hard pattern, even though it's just pattern 1 and pattern 2 in reality, it still is like very obvious how to solve a lot of this stuff once you figure out how trick reload works. I also think the fight is incredibly backloaded. The last 30% feels like 80% of the fight because the first 70% mechanics, while fun and interesting, and obviously there's room for error, they don't stand up to that last 30% nearly as well. And if I'm going to knock the tree and Pandemonium for being backloaded, I'm at least going to knock this fight. Fortunately, one of the benefits of Criterion is that the back end of a boss is 2 out of 5.5 minutes or something in that capacity. I think the 30% mark here is like 2.5 minutes until 0, and I think the enrage is like 5:54 or something like that. So an overall strong boss, but the weakest of all the final bosses, and definitely didn't deserve above the spots of some of the other bosses on this list. Number 4, however, is going to go to the first boss of Criterion 3, and that's of Kequk, aka, what do we call this? Alolan Kyogre, I think is what we actually called this boss while we were progging it. This is, I think, the staple boss that I would trial people for in a raid. This boss requires a lot of understanding mechanics, a lot of personal responsibility, and the ability to properly work with a partner and understanding where you need to go for mechanics. So it tests everything a player needs to be able to do at its most basic level. And not to mention, it's fast, it's fun, and on Savage, the healing and the damage check is actually fairly significant on this first boss alone. It's one of those bosses especially that tests your ability to work with a smaller hitbox as a melee DPS. This is the only boss that's ever made me look at Criterion and 100% consider a double ranged comp, especially with the way that they adjust the damage and how it's actually dealt. Something like Black Mage Machinist or Summoner Machinist, you know, without the battle res, you could just go for that raw damage in Black Mage and Machinist, and it would be great. Not to mention Dismantle and all that. Boss is serious business, is all I'm saying. Like, it's just from top to bottom, everything about it just kind of goes. I think the only thing it doesn't do super interestingly is engage the tank, and I think that's actually kind of a problem with all the Criterion bosses. The tank is engaged with the mechanics, but there's very seldom something that is super tank specific. Like you had blocking the orb on Gorai, for example, and there are a couple of things that your tank can do to really ease a lot of these mechanics. But the bosses that I think do have more tank responsibility are the bosses higher up on this list. And up to the point with Kequk, I'd feel like the tank is just another player participating who is going to take the autos and the occasional tank buster, throw out a reprisal, stuff like that. But I'm serious. If you're looking to improve your raid skill or you're looking to trial somebody for a raid, Kequk is, in my opinion, one of the better things you can make them do. Better than doing some 8-man savages or doing some low item level. Make them do this, because this will really reveal if they have some basic spatial weaknesses that can be really hindering for hardcore prog and savage or even in ultimate. Number 3 is actually going to be Silky, the very first Criterion boss we had. I thought long and hard about where Silky was going to end up on this list, because this rat terrorized people who were just going into Criterion for the first time when it was brand new. No one knew what to expect. This thing was beating the crap out of people. Now, I think Silky is the perfect example of what a Criterion boss should be. It's not number 1 on the list because I don't think it's the best boss, but it is the ideal model. And the fact that they nailed that on the very first boss we got over a year ago is just great, because having that baseline is great for judging all these bosses afterwards. Silky, first and foremost, I think is the best transfer of knowledge from doing multiple variant paths to doing Criterion. Heck, even doing Silky at all from variant gives you a lot of insight into how the Criterion version is going to work. That was a lesson learned that came in handy a lot going into Criterion 2 and 3, especially Criterion 3, where our group consciously decided not to run as a group of 4 and instead split off and all take different paths so we could scout as many mechanics as possible without having to actually do 12 runs. If organized, we probably could have just all split into 3 different modes and then done 2 or 3 runs each and gotten all the information. And Silky is the inspiration for that. Silky's mechanics are not crazy. They all have to do with his tail and how he interacts with the various brooms around the room. He can wash them, change their affinity, change where the safe spots are by doing that. You can force the brooms to move in certain patterns in order to avoid being washed. Players have to do bait mechanics. Players have to do very spatially aware mechanics. The tank has to do a ton of positioning. There's all these little things about this fight that just goes such a long way in terms of positioning and involving the players while they're fighting it, that it has to get credit. And all of the mechanics are unique from one another. You really don't get much of a repeat phase until the very end. And even on Savage, by then you're realistically just wrapping up the remainder of the fight and just doing a couple of small AoEs, like kind of just small patterns at the end for things as kind of like a nerve check, I suppose. It just gets a lot of credit from me. And similar to Kequk, this is a great boss to trial people with. And the main reason why I praised Criterion 1 so much was because of this and one other boss who hasn't been named on the list. So Silky, you get a ton of credit from me for just being built top to bottom like an absolute beast. I mean, you are a rat, but you know what I meant. Number 2, we're going to jump back over to Mount Rockon for their final boss, Mao the Restless. Now, this is another one similar to the Lala, where if you're really bad at understanding rotation mechanics and how the player is expected to interact with them, this fight can be either a very easy to understand and execute fight or a very difficult to understand and execute fight. It requires you to store knowledge in your brain, then be able to look at knowledge you need in the moment, and then position at the same time while making sure you're in the right spots. And I don't just mean position and in the right spots. I do mean that quite literally, because you're positioning your body based on what you need something to do, something to happen, but you also need to make sure you understand where the bad zones are at the same time. A very common skill in 14, but it's asking a lot of the players very much simultaneously, which is why this boss also gets a downtime phase. It was honestly one of the most fun bosses I've done the entire expansion, even just down to his basic sword swings. I mean, seeing the, you know, back in, right out, left out, and just needing to know how the fire and the boss turning every time it does a sword swing. It's very satisfying to pull off and is a very important skill. And I think it's a better test of that skill, personally, than the Lala is. They're in some capacity, but I personally like this version better. Whereas the other one is just a matter of forgetting how clocks work. This is a genuine understanding of why the boss is facing a certain direction, what the AoEs mean, how to quickly go between every possible pattern you can get, and appreciating the times when you get a really easy one instead. I think that maybe the end of the fight is not the strongest point, but at the very least, the fight does do its best to stay completely unique all the way through and not repeat any sort of really easy mechanic towards the end like some of the other bosses do, including other bosses that are high up on this list like Kequk, who does repeat the first two mechanics towards the end. The Lala also doing the same thing. So they definitely hit the nail on the head with this one, not to mention the Stormblood music has to get credit here. I love the Stormblood dungeon boss theme, and to have it used here was such a blast of the past that I appreciated. And finally, we get to number 1, which is also going back to the very first Criterion, the final boss of the Sildian Subterrane, Shadowcaster Zealous Ga. I would have never guessed an Amalja boss would be stuck at number 1 on the list, but this is a boss that does everything I've mentioned, but also created mechanics that I wanted to see used in other content. Whenever we get that moment where we see something we've actually never seen before and start imagining that this is the playground for this mechanic, we will see this mechanic again. Where will they use it? When am I going to be freaking out about it? Whenever you've been playing a game for 10 years and you see that mechanic, that sticks with you. And this boss executionally asks so much of the player. To also have that in there is just the icing on the cake. The rotation mechanics in here, again, I think a better test than both Mao the Restless and the Lala. Understanding how those portals are actually going to move, pattern recognition, so you don't need to think about the rotations nearly as much, the spatial awareness, because it doesn't always follow the markers on the ground, or at least it's not exactly the ground, like the actual layout of the arena telling you exactly where all the safe spots are going to be, all the possible patterns, knowing just how to identify them at a moment's glance, like all those things, very, very well tested here. The big thing for me, though, is the tripwires. The idea of here throwing a bunch of visual noise on the screen that's not necessarily flashy, but it's present. When you see all those tripwires first appear, you're kind of just immediately in a panic. You know, like you would with any new mechanic, but it's very much a lot being thrown at you at once, and then looking at your debuff and having to identify what the pattern actually is and then place yourself based on your number in the right spot. Again, basic Final Fantasy XIV skills. I think anyone can agree that ultimately stand in a location, let the mechanic resolve, is not exactly wrong. It's reductive, but it's not exactly wrong. For this one, though, you do have to move a little bit. Waiting your turn, making sure not to run too far, making sure not to go too early when you still have the magic vuln, understanding if you need to do horizontal or vertical lines first in order to dodge which AoEs on which side of the room, how much time you have to do all of that, and to be tested on that twice in two very unique scenarios in both the second mechanic and the final mechanic. It's just really, really good pressure on the player to be individual and quick, while also never letting off of the boss the entire time. Not to mention the portal mechanic, again, another good test of rotations, understanding how the arena is laid out, how you're going to be teleported, and what that responsibility means against the other 3 people. Because you can sometimes figure out what you're supposed to do, but at the same time, the movements of other people can be very, very off-putting to your own confidence here. And being able to know you know a mechanic and are confident in a mechanic goes a long way to doing that mechanic correctly and being able to teach other people that mechanic. So this portal mechanic really highlights those types of players, and I have to really appreciate it for it. So Shadowcaster Zealous Ga, you get number 1 on Criterion for being everything all the other bosses are with a little bit of extra salt and pepper on top. And those are my 9 Criterion bosses rated from worst to best. My only disappointment, and you've heard me say it before, is that the secret bosses from Variant are nowhere to be found in these final Criterion modes. There's not even present, not even a little bit. I don't know if that means replacing a trash pack. I don't know if that means just foregoing the way Savage is done and just throwing it into the Savage difficulty, but I feel like those are the bosses I wanted to see most, how they would change, and they were the only bosses not present. Hopefully that's a piece of feedback they catch going into the next expansion, because I don't want them to just make these assets for me to see one time doing the story and probably never do again. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap. Let me know what your list is in the comment section, if you've even done them. I mean, I guess you could rate them based on their variant versions, but, you know, I'm not doing that. I'm rating them solely based on their Criterion difficulty, and not even Criterion Savage, even though I threw a few comments in there about it. But yeah, let me know what your order is in the comment section of the video below. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I will see all of you in the next video. Until then, take care.